I'm Claire Donovan, 30 years old, and even after everything I've achieved, I've never been more than a disappointment to my parents. The morning of my grandfather's will reading, I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the collar of a black dress that wasn't mine. It had belonged to my mother years ago, passed down like a reminder of where I came from and how little I belonged. My hands were shaking not from grief, but from something colder anticipation mixed with dread. I knew how these things went in my family. Appearances came first, feelings came last, and somewhere between the marble floors and the mirrored conference rooms, I always disappeared. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand in a room full of people who pretended you didn't belong there. I grew up in a house that looked like success from the outside. 3 stories of polished stone-trimmed hedges and hallways that smelled faintly of lemon oil and control. The Donovans were a family of plans, not passions. My father ran Donovan Industries like a kingdom passed through generations, and my mother ruled its image with her perfectionist smile. My brother Ryan learned early how to charm boardrooms. I learned how to be quiet at the dinner table. When other kids drew with crayons, I carried around a disposable camera, fascinated by the way light could catch on glass or how a shadow could tell the truth about a room. My mother would shake her head and tell me, "You'll grow out of it, Claire." But I never did. The difference between Ryan and me became clear by the time we hit high school. He was their golden boy captain of everything destined to inherit everything. I was the daughter who forgot to wear the right shoes to the family banquet. Every family gathering was a competition I never entered, but always lost. My father spoke to me in lessons, not conversations. "Dreams don't pay dividends," he said once when I mentioned applying to art school. My mother didn't argue, she never argued, but her silence told me I shouldn't either. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I filled out the application anyway. I mailed it the next morning on my way to class and never told a soul. When the acceptance letter arrived, I thought maybe things would be different. I waited until dinner to tell them, sliding the envelope across the table like a peace offering. My father read the first line, set it down, and asked if I understood what the word career meant. My mother sighed her wine glass, catching the light. "It's a phase," she said softly, but there was no belief in her tone. Ryan smirked, slicing into his steak, as if my future were already settled. That was the night I learned silence could bruise just as much as words. 2 months later, I packed up my car and left for Boston with 2 scholarships and a secondhand camera I'd bought with saved babysitting money. The city was loud and rough in ways I hadn't expected. My apartment was a shoebox that smelled like paint thinner and rain, but it was mine. I worked nights at a coffee shop, took photos during the day, and learned how to turn struggle into focus. Most of my family didn't even know where I lived. My mother sent one Christmas card the first year, no return address, just "take care of yourself." My father didn't write at all, but my grandfather Henry, the founder of everything they worshipped, sent postcards sometimes. They never said much, just a single line, usually written in careful block letters, "Still taking pictures" or "Keep your eye." It didn't sound like much, but it meant everything. The last time I saw him alive wasn't planned. I'd finished a late photo shoot and found myself parked outside his old brownstone downtown, the one he never sold even after the company moved to newer offices. When he opened the door, thinner and slower than before, he gave me that same half smile I remembered from childhood. "A Donovan who actually knocks," he said. Inside, the place smelled of cedar and ink. We didn't talk about the family or business. He asked about my work, about what I was trying to say through my photographs. I told him I was capturing the places people leave behind, the forgotten corners, the half-lit homes. He listened, really listened, and then said something that never left me. "Truth costs more than people think, Claire. But don't let them take your eye. It's your gift and your rebellion." When I left that day, he pressed a small film camera into my hand, his own. I thought it was just a sentimental gesture. I didn't realize it was a warning. He passed away 3 weeks later, and the house fell into the hum of logistics, funeral arrangements, estate talk, public statements. My parents moved through it like professionals, every tear rehearsed, every word for show. I stayed quiet, doing what I always did, watching, recording in my mind the cracks in the perfection. When the call came about, the will reading my mother's tone was clipped, "Be on time. Don't make this about you." I didn't reply. I just ironed my dress and promised myself I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me small. That morning the law office gleamed like a stage polished for judgment. My parents sat near the head of the long table, poised as ever, my brother already scrolling through emails like he was waiting for a board vote. I took a seat near the end, folded my hands, and tried to steady the pulse in my throat. The lawyer, Mr. Bennett, entered right on schedule, with a folder thick enough to hold a century of expectations. As he began reading, the room filled with nods and smug smiles, vacation homes, stocks, antiques, all the familiar rewards of loyalty. Then he paused. To Claire Donovan, he read slowly, the sum of $10. The laughter came quick, sharp, echoing cruel. My father leaned back, shaking his head. Guess that's what happens when you quit the family. My mother hid her smile behind a manicured hand. Even Ryan let out a quiet chuckle. I stared at the polished table, fighting the sting behind my eyes. $10. That was all my grandfather's legacy thought I was worth. And yet, as Mr. Bennett cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, something in his tone made the room fall silent. Actually, he said, glancing toward me, there's a private letter addressed only to Miss Donovan. The sound of laughter died instantly. My mother's smile faded. My father straightened his eyes, narrowing. I felt every gaze turn toward me as the lawyer reached for a sealed envelope. For the first time that morning, I saw something unfamiliar in their faces. Fear. The room stayed still for a moment after Mr. Bennett spoke, as if even the air had forgotten how to move. My father's chair creaked when he shifted his jaw tight. My mother's hand froze mid-gesture, her polished nails hovering above her lap. Ryan stopped scrolling his phone and looked at me confused. No one said a word. The only sound was the low hum of the ceiling vent and the faint rustle of papers as Mr. Bennett reached for a cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. My name was written on the front in my grandfather's handwriting, sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. Mr. Bennett placed the envelope in front of me and spoke quietly. This letter was written specifically for you, Claire. Your grandfather asked that you read it in private. My father frowned, his voice cutting through the silence. Private. We're family Bennett. If it concerns the estate, it concerns all of us. My mother nodded sharply beside him, but Mr. Bennett didn't waver. Those were Mr. Donovan's instructions. No exceptions. He turned to me with a calm expression. There's an adjoining room you can use. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor, and felt their eyes on my back as I followed Mr. Bennett down the short hallway. Each step sounded too loud, like walking on glass. He opened the door to a smaller office and motioned me inside. The air felt cooler there, quieter. He placed the letter on the desk and said softly, "Take your time." Then he left, closing the door behind him. For a long moment I just stared at the envelope. The wax seal was stamped with a small design, a tiny camera etched into the surface. My breath caught. Grandpa's camera, the same symbol carved into the handle of the old film camera he'd given me. I ran my thumb along the edge before breaking the seal. Inside were several folded pages written in his steady, careful hand. The first line made my throat tighten. My dearest Claire. He apologized for what had just happened in the conference room, for the laughter and humiliation. It was meant to happen, he wrote. You needed to see them as they are when they believe you have nothing left. I sat back in the chair, the words sinking in like a slow tide. He had planned this, every detail. I kept reading my eyes, tracing the lines that changed everything I thought I knew about him. The $10, he said, was a diversion, a way to protect what truly mattered. He had created a separate trust, an entity called the Donovan Creative Foundation, quietly and legally transferred outside the reach of the company board. I was its sole beneficiary. The trust owned several properties, including a Beacon Street penthouse, a private art gallery, and a 70% share of the family's philanthropic and creative investments. The rest of the estate, the vacation homes and stocks, were just noise compared to this. I read the words twice, trying to believe them. I built my empire with my hands, he continued, but I built this with my eyes. You are the only one who inherited that. My pulse quickened as I reached the next page. He had purchased nearly every photograph I'd ever sold during those early struggling years, under aliases I'd never recognized. They were never forgotten, Claire. They were cataloged, framed, and preserved. I wanted you to see what happens when someone believes in what you see. The room blurred for a moment. I blinked, pressing my palm to the paper to steady it. In the next paragraph, he gave me a choice. I wasn't expected to become the face of the company or attend board meetings in gray suits. I was asked only to remain true to the thing that separated me from the rest of them, my vision, my integrity, my eye. The trust is yours to shape, not to defend. Use it as light, not armor. At the bottom of the letter was a small black box. I hadn't noticed it when I first opened the envelope. Inside was a brass key attached to a thin leather cord, and beneath it a folded card with his handwriting, "Beacon Street top floor, your new studio, your real inheritance." I traced the letters slowly, my fingers trembling. When I finally lifted my eyes, the sunlight spilling through the blinds had shifted across the floor. I sat there for a long time listening to the faint traffic outside, trying to absorb the weight of what he had done. The same man who'd built an empire of steel and glass had left me something invisible, yet immense trust and the freedom to use it. When I stepped back into the conference room, every head turned. The laughter had faded into low conversation, but it stopped the moment I opened the door. My mother straightened in her chair, her smile stiff. My father leaned forward, trying to read my face. Ryan looked restless, waiting for me to speak. I gave them nothing. I folded the letter back into my purse and took my seat at the far end of the table. My father spoke first. "Well, I hope it was worth the drama." His tone was half amusement, half challenge. I nodded once. "It was," I said evenly. My mother tilted her head, her voice light but sharp. "He probably left her an apology note," she said. "Your grandfather always had a soft spot for the sentimental." Ryan chuckled, but it sounded forced. Mr. Bennett closed the folder in front of him and stood. "That concludes the reading," he announced. "All official documents have been distributed." My father pushed his chair back, clearly ready to leave. My mother gathered her handbag. Ryan reached across the table and tapped his phone. "Guess that's that," he said. But I stayed seated, still composed, the weight of the key hidden in my palm. As they made small talk near the door, I studied them, the way my father's confidence returned, as quickly as it had cracked, the way my mother's laughter filled the space, where sincerity never lived, the way Ryan already spoke about estate taxes as if he'd earned them. Grandpa had been right. I needed to see them as they truly were, and now I had. When they finally walked out, I looked over at Mr. Bennett, who lingered near the window. He met my eyes and nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had just changed. "If you'd like," he said, "I can arrange a visit to the Beacon Street property. It's yours now." "I'll go tomorrow," I replied. My voice was calm, but my hands trembled slightly as I gathered my purse. I walked out of that glass building without looking back. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright, almost too bright. The city moved around me in the usual rhythm, taxis chatter wind between the buildings, but something inside me had shifted. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid the letter flat on my kitchen table, reading the final paragraph over and over. They laughed, Claire, but they laughed too soon. Every word felt deliberate, like he'd written it, knowing exactly how that day would unfold. I opened my drawer and pulled out the small film camera he'd given me years ago. The leather strap was cracked, the metal worn smooth. I hadn't used it in a long time. I ran my fingers along the shutter and thought of the day he'd placed it in my hands, telling me not to let inheritance take my eye. By morning, the decision was clear. I called Mr. Bennett to confirm our meeting. When I arrived at the Beacon Street address later that afternoon, the doorman greeted me with quiet respect and handed me an envelope labeled Harper Light Studio. My pulse quickened as I stepped into the elevator. The doors opened to a space bathed in light floor-to-ceiling windows, hardwood floors and walls lined with frames. I recognized them immediately. My photographs, every single one. Each print was carefully mounted and tagged with handwritten notes, dates, locations, even small observations in my grandfather's tidy script. He had followed my work all along, quietly collecting it, preserving what I thought the world had forgotten. There was a brass plaque near the entrance engraved with the name Donovan Light Studio. I stood there for a long time, surrounded by proof that he had understood me all along. As evening fell, the city lights shimmered beyond the windows. I unlocked a small drawer in the desk and found another note inside. The foundation is yours, but its purpose is yours to define. Legacy is not what we keep, it's what we create. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. Down below, the city pulsed with life. Somewhere in a marble office, my parents were probably celebrating their victory. They had no idea what their laughter had cost them. I smiled faintly, not out of revenge, but understanding. Grandpa's final test wasn't about money, it was about vision. He wanted to see if I could stand on my own when everyone else turned away. And now that I had, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I returned to the Beacon Street studio the next morning, long before the city had fully woken. The elevator opened to a room washed in early light quiet, except for the hum of traffic below. The photographs along the walls seemed almost alive in that hour, the way the glass caught the sunrise, the way every frame told a story I didn't know he'd been keeping. My grandfather had built a museum of my past without ever saying a word. I ran my fingers along the brass plaque again, Donovan Light Studio, the name he'd chosen for something he would never see completed. Mr. Bennett arrived soon after with another folder tucked under his arm. He wanted you to have full discretion, he said, laying it on the desk. Inside were legal documents detailing the transfer of the foundation and the assets it held. A trust account, several property deeds, and a separate note authorizing a long-term advisor named Lydia Marshall to assist with operations. I skimmed the name, not recognizing it, and asked who she was. Your grandfather's silent partner, Mr. Bennett replied. She helped establish the creative arm years ago. Thought it might be time you met. Lydia arrived that afternoon, a woman with calm eyes and an easy confidence. She introduced herself with a firm handshake. I worked with Henry for over 20 years, she said. He didn't just build factories, you know. He built ideas. This, she gestured around the studio, was his favorite one. She explained how Henry had quietly moved parts of his wealth into philanthropic work artist grants, youth programs, community workshops, projects the rest of the family never knew about. He said legacy meant nothing if it only fed itself, she added. We spent hours going through files and portfolios, tracing the hidden branches of the foundation. My name appeared in several notes scribbled in his handwriting. Keep for Claire, she'll know what to do. It was strange seeing myself written into a man's plans who had always seemed so distant in life. As we worked, Lydia spoke with quiet fondness about him, how he'd kept a small darkroom in the basement of his old brownstone, developing photos when everyone thought he'd given up that hobby decades ago. She smiled faintly. He told me once if Claire ever finds this place, it means she's earned it. That night after Lydia left, I walked through the studio alone. The city glowed outside, neon lights blurring against the windows. I sat at the long wooden table in the center of the room and laid the letter in front of me again. I read the final paragraph, slowly letting the words settle. Use it as light, not armor. I thought about what that meant, how easily power could become a weapon, how easy it would be to use this to prove them wrong. But that wasn't what he wanted. He'd left me something meant to outlast the noise of their judgment. Over the next few days, I stayed quiet. My phone filled with unread messages from my mother and brother, short, polite texts pretending concern, but asking questions they didn't have the right to ask. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to reveal anything. Mr. Bennett handled the legal transitions, discreetly transferring the assets to my name one by one. He was patient, efficient, and oddly protective, as if he understood that silence was my shield for now. By the end of the week, I'd spent more time in that studio than I had anywhere else in months. The light there was different, soft, in the morning golden by afternoon. I began photographing it frame by frame, the way I once captured empty streets or faded signs. But this time, the emptiness felt intentional, not lonely. I found peace in the rhythm of it, developing film, cataloging prints, sketching out new ideas on paper. I wanted to create something that would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. A week later, Lydia returned with coffee and a plan. If you're serious about opening this space, she said, you need to think about your first show. The idea felt both terrifying and inevitable. "He wanted you to use it," she reminded me, "not hide it." We spent the afternoon discussing possibilities: a solo exhibit, a limited guest list, something intimate but impossible to ignore. She suggested we title it The Inheritance of Light. I smiled, shaking my head. "Too obvious," I said. After a moment of silence, I looked at the wall of photos, my earliest works beside my latest, and said, "Maybe The Inheritance of Vision." She nodded, satisfied. "That sounds like Henry." The next weeks blurred into preparation. Invitations were designed minimal cream-colored, embossed with the studio's name. Mr. Bennett helped manage logistics, and Lydia coordinated the installation. I watched as technicians mounted the final pieces, each photograph telling a fragment of the story I'd lived years of invisibility turned into proof of presence. In the center of the gallery, I left a space empty for one final piece still framed in my mind. When the invitations were ready, I sent them quietly. Critics, curators, donors, and my family. Their names were written in identical envelopes delivered by certified mail. Ryan responded within hours, a short text, "See you there." My mother's reply came a day later. "We'll try to stop by." My father said nothing. I didn't expect him to. But I heard through Ryan that they planned to attend curiosity outweighing pride. It was exactly what I wanted. Each day leading to the opening felt like holding my breath. I arrived early every morning and stayed late, walking through the rooms to make sure everything was perfect. Lydia caught me one evening standing in front of the empty pedestal at the center. "You still haven't decided what goes there?" she asked. I looked at her and smiled faintly. "I have," I said. "They just don't know it yet." The night before the show, I framed the final piece. It wasn't a photograph at all, but the original check, $10 signed and dated, now mounted under glass. Beneath it, on a small metal plaque, I engraved the words, "Gifted to Claire Donovan at the will reading of Henry Donovan, value priceless." And below that, a single line, "Sometimes the smallest inheritance is the greatest test." I stood there for a long time after it was hung, the quiet hum of the lights above echoing in the stillness. When the evening of the opening arrived, the studio glowed. Warm light spilled across the floor, music played softly in the background, and guests filled the room in elegant murmurs. Critics examined the pieces, cameras flashed, and for the first time, the space felt alive. I greeted guests with calm gratitude, my name on every program, my photographs lining every wall. The story was no longer hidden. It was illuminated. Halfway through the evening, I saw them. My parents walked in together, polished and poised, as if attending a fundraiser. My mother wore pearls and a careful smile. My father looked around the room like he was evaluating a merger. Ryan followed behind, his expression curious. For a moment, none of them seemed to recognize the place or realize it belonged to me. Then my father's gaze landed on the brass plaque near the entrance. I watched his jaw tighten slightly as he read the name Donovan Light Studio. They moved through the crowd, slowly murmuring polite compliments, but I could feel their confusion growing. My mother approached me first. "This is quite something," she said, her tone practiced. "Did someone sponsor this?" I met her eyes and replied simply, "Just one believer." She blinked, unsure what that meant. Ryan, glancing around, whispered, "You run this." I nodded, "Since always." I didn't tell them what the night was leading to. They would find out soon enough. Mr. Bennett arrived right on time, greeting the guests with his usual calm demeanor. When he caught my eye, he gave a subtle nod, the signal we'd agreed on. I stepped aside as he made his way to the small platform near the centerpiece. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the room, "thank you for joining us tonight at Donovan Light Studio, founded by and dedicated to the artistic vision of Claire Donovan." The murmur that followed rippled like a wave. Cameras turned, flashes sparked. "It's also my honor to announce," he continued, "that Miss Donovan is the sole beneficiary of the Donovan Creative Foundation established by her grandfather, Henry Donovan." I heard my mother's soft gasp before I saw her expression. My father's face went pale, his lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. Ryan stared, caught between disbelief and realization. Mr. Bennett raised his glass. Henry believed legacy should follow merit, not lineage. Tonight, his belief stands in its purest form. Applause filled the room, warm, thunderous, undeniable. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at them. My father's fists clenched. My mother's eyes darted for an exit, and Ryan's composure cracked into something like shame. I stepped forward, calm, steady, meeting their gaze as the applause faded. "You laughed," I said quietly, "but it seems you laughed too soon." They said nothing. And in that silence, surrounded by light and the truth my grandfather had trusted me with, I finally understood what real inheritance felt like. When the applause finally faded, I could still hear the echo of my grandfather's name ringing softly through the room. The guests raised their glasses, smiling toward the stage, while my family stood frozen where they were. My mother's pearls shimmered under the lights, but her expression had gone rigid. My father's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. Ryan shifted his weight uneasily, glancing between them and me, like he wasn't sure which side of the story he belonged to anymore. I stepped down from the platform, walking toward them as the crowd began mingling again. My mother was the first to speak, her voice low but trembling. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. I met her eyes and answered quietly, "Because you never asked." My father's tone hardened. This was some kind of performance, wasn't it? A setup to humiliate us in front of half the city. I shook my head slowly. "No, this was a mirror. You just didn't like what you saw." They stared at me, neither willing to say another word. For a moment, the noise of the party seemed to fade, replaced by the distant hum of the city outside. Ryan broke the silence first. "Claire," he said softer than I expected this is real. You're running all of this." I nodded once. Grandpa left it to me. Every piece of it. He opened his mouth to speak again, but my mother touched his arm and he stopped. They turned and left without another word, their footsteps sharp against the hardwood floor. I stayed where I was, surrounded by light, by faces that actually saw me. People approached with congratulations, asking about my work, about my plans for the studio. But beneath the surface, I could still feel the quiet storm building in the space my family had just vacated. After the event ended, the studio grew still again. I walked to the center of the room, standing before the framed check under its spotlight. The words on the plaque caught the last of the evening's light. Sometimes the smallest inheritance is the greatest test. I stood there for a long moment before turning off the lights, leaving the studio bathed in the faint glow of the city below. The following morning, my phone rang before sunrise. It was Ryan. His voice was tight, cautious. "They're furious," he said. "Dad's been on the phone all night. He's calling the board, trying to figure out if any of this can be reversed." I sighed. "It can't. Grandpa made sure of that." There was silence on the line. "You really kept this quiet," he said finally. "You always underestimated him," I replied. "He never did anything halfway." For the next week, the phone barely stopped ringing calls from my parents, their lawyers, their associates. I ignored them all, Mr. Bennett assured me everything was legally sealed and beyond contest. Still, my father tried to meet with me in person, sending messages through Ryan, through mutual acquaintances, even through Lydia. She stopped by one afternoon, holding a stack of mail and a tired smile. "He's not used to losing," she said. "Especially not like this." I nodded, setting the mail aside. "He still doesn't see it," I said quietly. "He thinks this was about money." Lydia studied me for a moment. "And what was it about for you?" I looked out the window, watching the clouds gather over the city. "Truth," I said, "and freedom." In the weeks that followed, the noise began to fade. The papers ran small stories about the gallery's debut, most of them describing it as the quiet rise of an unexpected heir. My name began appearing in places it never had before: interviews, feature articles, invitations. I accepted a few, declined most. I wasn't interested in publicity. I was interested in what came next. Lydia and I began planning a residency program under the Donovan Creative Foundation. She suggested we focus on emerging artists with limited access to resources, photographers, sculptors, painters, who had vision but no means to show it. I agreed immediately. "Grandpa would have wanted that," I said, and she smiled. "He told me once that art was the only truth that could survive a boardroom." Meanwhile, my parents stayed silent. Weeks passed without a word. It wasn't until late February that I received a letter in my mailbox, written in my mother's handwriting. The paper smelled faintly of her perfume. "We're still your family," it began. "Whatever happened, this can't be the way it ends." There was no apology, just a plea for appearance for control. I folded the letter once and placed it in a drawer without replying. Ryan, however, did show up. He came to the studio one afternoon unannounced, dressed in a gray suit that looked too formal for daylight. He walked through the exhibit, slowly stopping at a few photos, taking his time before speaking. "You know," he said, "Dad's not going to forgive this." I nodded. "He doesn't have to." Ryan turned toward me, his voice softer. "He built everything for us, Claire." I met his gaze. "No, he built it for himself. Grandpa built for us." He didn't argue. He just stood there for a long time looking at the framed check on the wall. "You really think this changes anything?" he asked. "It already has," I said. He gave a small, uncertain nod and walked out. That night, I worked late at the studio sorting through portfolios from artists who'd applied to our first residency program. The submissions came from all over: students, freelancers, even retirees rediscovering their craft. Reading their letters, I saw pieces of my own journey in every one of them. When Lydia stopped by to check on progress, I told her I wanted to fund them all. She smiled, shaking her head gently. "You're your grandfather's granddaughter," she said. "All heart." The following week, I attended my first board meeting as the foundation's chair. The older trustees looked skeptical when I arrived, some surprised to see me dressed in black jeans and boots instead of the expected suit. But when I laid out the 3-year plan for grants, community partnerships, and a sustainable art residency model, the room went quiet. By the end of the meeting, the same men who had doubted me were nodding in agreement. When it was over, Lydia caught up with me in the hallway. "He'd be proud," she said. I smiled faintly. He already was. Later that evening, I returned to the penthouse. The air felt still, the city lights stretching endlessly across the skyline. On the desk sat a photograph I hadn't hung yet, one of my grandfather standing by his old brownstone window, looking out at the street below. I placed it beside the framed $10 check. The two pieces belonged together side by side. I poured myself a cup of tea and stood by the window watching the city move below. Somewhere out there, my parents were probably still trying to make sense of how the balance had shifted. But it didn't matter. The weight that had followed me for years was gone, replaced by something quieter: resolve. As the night deepened, I thought about what my grandfather had written: "Use it as light, not armor." I finally understood. This wasn't about revenge. It was about creating something that couldn't be erased, something that would last long after the noise stopped. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the glass, soft and steady. I reached for my camera, lifted it toward the window, and took a single photograph of the city in the rain. A new beginning, framed in silence, and though I didn't know what the next chapter would hold, I was ready for it. Spring settled into the city with quiet warmth, and with it came the first group of residents for the Donovan Creative Foundation. There were 6 artists in total, each carrying their own stories, their own ways of seeing the world. I met them one by one as they moved into the studio's upper floors: painters, sculptors, photographers, dreamers, who reminded me of who I used to be. Among them was Grace Whitmore, a 27-year-old photographer from Kansas, with bright eyes and a hesitant smile. She carried her camera like it was part of her heartbeat. Grace was the last to arrive, showing up with 2 worn suitcases and a roll of canvas strapped to her shoulder. She looked both nervous and determined, her voice soft when she thanked me for the opportunity. "I never thought someone like me would get picked," she said as we toured the building. I smiled. "That's why you were," I told her. The residency began quietly. Mornings filled with soft footsteps on the stairwell, the scent of paint and coffee drifting through the hallways. By afternoon, the building hummed with creative energy, artists sketching in corners, cameras clicking brushes, tapping against glass jars. I spent most days in my office reviewing grant proposals and fine-tuning budgets, but every evening I made time to walk through the studios talking with each resident. Those conversations became my favorite part of the day. Grace often stayed late in the darkroom developing photographs until midnight. Sometimes I'd find her there, her hands steady under the red glow, her eyes studying each image with quiet reverence. One night she looked up from the tray and asked, "Do you ever worry people won't see your work for what it is, just for who you are?" I paused before answering. "All the time," I said. "But the only thing that matters is that you know what you're trying to say." She nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "I guess that's what your grandfather saw in you." Her words stayed with me long after she turned back to her prints. Lydia became a steady presence, balancing the administrative chaos while mentoring the younger artists. Together, we built the rhythm of something that finally felt alive. She often reminded me that the foundation's success wasn't in headlines or events, it was in moments like these where creativity replaced fear. "You're leading with the same grace Henry admired," she said one afternoon, her tone kind but firm. "Don't let their noise pull you back." By "there" she meant my parents. They hadn't called in weeks, but their silence carried its own weight. Now and then rumors reached me through mutual contacts, my father losing partners at the firm, my mother stepping down from several committees. Each story came with a tone of pity, as if the family's downfall were a public performance. I tried not to think about it, but some nights I'd still wake to the echo of their laughter from that will reading sharp and cold as glass. The first showcase for the residents arrived in late May. We transformed the studio into a gallery once again, this time filled with their work portraits of resilience, abstract colors of loss and hope, photographs of places most people forgot existed. It wasn't a grand affair, but it carried meaning in every corner. The artists spoke about their inspiration, their challenges, their gratitude for being seen. Watching them, I realized the foundation had already become what my grandfather wanted: light carried forward. After the event ended, Grace found me near the window overlooking the city. She handed me a small framed photo, one she'd taken during her first week. It was of the studio at dawn sunlight, streaming through the tall windows, empty chairs casting long shadows across the floor. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for giving people like me a place to start." I studied the photo quietly before setting it down on my desk. "You earned it," I said. That night, when the building finally went quiet, I walked through the halls alone. The scent of paint still lingered, faint but warm. I stopped in front of the photograph Grace had given me and thought of my grandfather's words, "Use it as light, not armor." The meaning had grown with time. Light wasn't about being seen, it was about letting others see too. The next few months passed in quiet purpose. The foundation expanded, forming partnerships with community colleges and small-town art programs. Lydia coordinated grants for workshops in rural areas, while I began preparing for a summer exhibit highlighting the residents' progress. Each project reminded me how far I'd come from that day in the law office, sitting beneath the weight of my family's laughter. Then one afternoon in July, I received a message from my father. Just 2 words. "We need to talk." I stared at it for a long time, uncertain whether to respond. Before I could decide, Lydia appeared at my door holding the day's mail. "You okay?" she asked, noticing my expression. I handed her the phone. She read the message and exhaled softly. "You knew this was coming," she said. He called the next morning, his tone clipped and businesslike. "We should meet," he said. "There are things we need to discuss about the company and about appearances." I kept my voice even. "There's nothing left to discuss, Dad. The trust is separate. You can't undo it." He paused, then said quietly, "I didn't raise you to turn your back on family." I answered before he could continue. "You didn't raise me at all. Grandpa did." Then I hung up. For the first time in years, I felt nothing but calm. No anger, no guilt, just a quiet certainty that the distance was necessary. That evening, I told Lydia what happened. She listened without interruption, then said simply, "Good. Now you can move forward." A week later, Ryan stopped by unannounced. He looked tired, his confidence worn thin. "They're struggling," he said, standing in my office doorway. "Dad's business is under review, and Mom's, she's not handling any of this well." I met his eyes. "I'm sorry," I said honestly, "but they made their choices." He nodded slowly, glancing at the photos on my wall. "You really did it, didn't you? Built something of your own." His voice softened. He'd be proud. When he left, the room felt different, quieter, lighter somehow. I realized then that some wounds don't close because they're meant to remind you where you've been. By early fall, the Foundation's programs were running smoothly. Grace's photographs were featured in a local arts magazine, and 2 other residents had been offered gallery representation. Seeing their success filled me with the kind of pride that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with legacy. One evening, as I was locking up, Grace appeared in the hallway with her camera slung around her neck. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked quietly. I hesitated. "Sometimes," I said, "but not the way I used to." She nodded, then smiled faintly. "My mom used to say forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you." She lifted her camera, framed me in the soft hallway light, and clicked the shutter. "You'll want to remember this someday," she said. After she left, I stood there for a while, letting the echo of her words settle in the empty building. Forgiveness. Maybe it would come, but not yet. Not before the work was finished. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the glass, reflecting the name Donovan Light Studio in soft gold letters. I locked the door and glanced back once more before stepping into the night. The path ahead wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time that was enough. The autumn air carried a chill that slipped easily through the studio's tall windows. It had been nearly a year since the will reading, though. Sometimes it felt much longer. The Donovan Creative Foundation had found its rhythm expanding beyond the city with quiet strength. The residency program thrived. New artists arrived each quarter, and the board meetings had shifted from skepticism to support. Even so, I knew calm in my world never lasted forever. One late afternoon, Lydia appeared at my office door holding her tablet and a cup of coffee. "You should see this," she said, setting it down in front of me. The headline flashed across the screen: Donovan Industries under federal review, misuse of corporate funds alleged. My chest tightened as I skimmed the article. The accusations were serious, unreported financial transfers, questionable campaign donations, falsified expense reports. The company's name was everywhere, along with my father's. Lydia waited until I finished reading. "It's only just starting," she said quietly. "A journalist named Martin Hale has been investigating for months. He's asking questions about the family's charitable divisions." I looked up, startled. "The foundation?" She shook her head. "Not directly, but he'll come knocking. You're the only Donovan with a clean record, and the only one with Henry's legacy tied to her name." 2 days later, he did. Martin Hale was courteous but relentless, a man with the calm precision of someone who'd learned that truth had to be earned. We met in the studio's conference room, sunlight glinting off the brass fixtures as he opened his notebook. "Ms. Donovan," he began, "I want to be clear, I'm not here to harm your work, but your family's company is at the center of a major investigation. Anything you can share about the separation between your foundation and their finances could help." His voice was steady, but his eyes searched mine for cracks. I told him the truth, that the foundation's assets were legally separate, built from a private trust created by my grandfather years before his death. I explained that I had full control, no board interference, no shared accounts. He nodded, writing notes quickly, then paused. "Do you believe your grandfather foresaw this?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated before answering. "I think he understood the danger of power without conscience," I said. Martin studied me for a long moment, then closed his notebook. "That's a rare kind of foresight," he said quietly. After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring out at the skyline. Below the noise of the city, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, measured steady, reminding me to see things as they were, not as I wished them to be. Over the next week, the investigation deepened. News stations ran daily updates. My father's image flashed across screens, his confident posture now shadowed by the weight of scrutiny. My mother stayed hidden behind gated doors, issuing no statements, avoiding cameras. Ryan, caught in the middle, sent me a brief message. "They're unraveling everything." Lydia urged me to remain silent to protect the foundation's integrity. "Your work speaks for itself," she said. "Don't let their mistakes drown it out." Still, I couldn't escape the feeling that the past was circling back, demanding to be faced. One evening, as the city lights flickered against the rain-soaked windows, I received an unexpected call from my mother. Her voice was thin, frayed at the edges. "Claire," she said softly, "your father wants to meet. Things have changed." I asked where. "At the old house," she whispered. "He just needs to see you." I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe part of me wanted closure, or maybe I wanted to see for myself what had become of the people who once laughed at a $10 check. The Donovan estate looked smaller than I remembered. The gates were open, the hedges overgrown. Inside, the air smelled of dust and disuse. My father sat in his study, the same room where so many family discussions had turned into dismissals. But this time he looked older, his posture slumped, his hair more gray than silver. My mother stood by the fireplace, arms folded tightly, her eyes wary. "He didn't waste time with pleasantries. They're tearing the company apart," he said. "Auditors, investigators. It's all over the news. I need your help, Claire. Your name still carries weight." His tone carried the same authority it always had, but the edge was dulled. "If you could issue a statement," he continued, "something about the family's values, about your grandfather's vision." I cut him off. "No." The word hung between us. His eyes narrowed more in disbelief than anger. "This isn't about pride," he said. "It's about preserving what he built." I met his gaze. "He built the truth, not an illusion. You're the ones who tore it down." My mother's voice trembled. "You don't understand, Claire. Without the company, everything collapses." I turned toward her. "Maybe it needs to." Silence filled the room. For a moment, I saw something break in my father's expression. Not rage, not defeat, but something quieter, like realization. He leaned back slowly, exhaling. "You sound just like him," he said. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. When I left the house, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner somehow. I walked to my car without looking back. A few days later, Martin called again. "The report's going public," he said. "Your family's involvement runs deeper than expected. I wanted to warn you your foundation might be mentioned, but only to clarify that it's independent." I thanked him for the courtesy. Before hanging up, he said, "For what it's worth, Ms. Donovan, people are noticing what you've built. They see the difference. When the story aired, it was worse than anyone predicted. Misuse of funds, falsified documents, bribery, all tied to Donovan Industries. My father resigned under pressure within a week. The company's shares plummeted, and my parents disappeared from public view entirely. For years, they'd built their lives around the illusion of control, and now that illusion had turned to dust. Through it all, I stayed silent. The foundation statement prepared by Lydia and approved by our legal team was brief and clear. The Donovan Creative Foundation remains fully independent, committed to the ethical stewardship and creative vision established by Henry Donovan. It was enough. The storm passed around us, not through us. That night after the news broke, Grace knocked on my office door. She stood there quietly for a moment before speaking. "I saw the report," she said. "I just wanted to say you don't owe anyone your silence, but the way you carry it. It's powerful." I gave a small nod. Sometimes the quietest stance is the loudest one. She smiled faintly, then left me to the stillness of the room. I sat at my desk, the lights dim, the city stretched out below. On the wall beside me hung the framed check and the photograph of my grandfather side by side, reminders of how far the truth could travel when you refused to hide from it. I reached for my camera, lifted it toward the window, and pressed the shutter once. Outside, the skyline shimmered half in shadow, half in light. It struck me then that the story wasn't over. Not mine, not his, not even theirs. The difference now was simple. For the first time, I was the one writing it. The weeks after the scandal unfolded were a blur of interviews, statements, and silence. My father had officially stepped down the company, placed under interim leadership, while investigators unraveled what was left of its reputation. Reporters filled the news cycle with speculation, and though my name appeared in their headlines, it wasn't for the reasons I once feared. The honest heir. One article called me. I didn't know whether to laugh or turn the page. At the foundation, life carried on. The artists continued their work. The studio lights glowed late into the night. Lydia made sure everything ran smoothly, but I could see the strain behind her steady calm. The phone rang more than usual, reporters, donors, former partners trying to align themselves with the one Donovan name that hadn't been tarnished. I turned down nearly every request. I wasn't interested in capitalizing on damage control. Then one afternoon, Ryan appeared at the gallery without warning. He looked tired, like the weight of the past months had finally settled across his shoulders. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I led him into my office, where the afternoon light spilled across the walls in narrow bands. He sat down, glancing at the framed photo of our grandfather on the shelf. "Mom and Dad are leaving the city," he said after a long pause. "They sold the house." I didn't respond right away. "Where will they go?" I asked. "Arizona," he said. "Somewhere quiet. Dad's calling it a fresh start." He laughed under his breath, though there was no humor in it. "He's still trying to make it sound like a business decision." I folded my hands on the desk. "Are you going with them?" He shook his head. "No. I think it's time I figure out who I am without all that noise." He looked up at me, his expression unguarded. "I was wrong about you, Claire. I see that now." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The apology was quiet, but it carried the weight of years. I nodded once, my throat tight. "We all played our parts," I said. "It just took me longer to stop playing mine." He stood to leave, pausing at the door. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think Grandpa favored you because you reminded him of Grandma. But I think I was wrong about that too. You reminded him of who he wanted to be." Then he was gone. That night, the city lights outside the studio windows looked softer somehow. I stayed late reviewing the Foundation's next phase of projects, expanding grants, opening satellite studios in smaller towns. Each new file was a story waiting to happen, each name another chance to turn legacy into something living. A few days later, Grace found me in the darkroom, sleeves rolled up, hands stained faintly with developer. She carried a photo still wet from the rinse. "I thought you should see this," she said, holding it out. The picture showed the residency floor, every artist at work, sunlight spilling across the tables. In the center, my grandfather's old camera sat on a windowsill, its reflection catching the light. "It feels like he's still here," she said softly. I nodded, tracing the outline of the camera in the photo. "He is," I whispered, "in every frame." The next morning, I received an unexpected envelope at the studio postmarked from Arizona. Inside was a handwritten letter in my mother's looping script. "We understand if you can't forgive us yet. Your father regrets the things he said. He reads about your work every week. I hope one day you'll visit." There was no signature beyond her name. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I tucked the letter into the same drawer that held my grandfather's final note. Some things needed time to find their meaning. Later that week, the Foundation hosted a private event for donors and alumni. The main exhibit featured the residents' completed work, each piece a reflection of growth and endurance. Lydia stood beside me as guests arrived. "A year ago," she said quietly, "this was just an idea. Now it's a movement." I smiled. "He'd be proud," I said. "So would you," she replied. When the speeches ended, I took the stage for a brief address. The crowd fell silent as I stepped up to the microphone, the soft hum of the city seeping through the glass walls. "A year ago, I began this studio opened in memory of a man who believed in what couldn't be measured: integrity, creativity, truth. He once told me that legacy isn't what we keep, it's what we build." I glanced toward the framed $10 check hanging in the corner, illuminated under its spotlight. Sometimes the smallest inheritance teaches the biggest lesson. The audience applauded, the sound warm and steady echoing through the gallery. Afterward, as the crowd thinned, Martin Hale approached me. He had been invited at Lydia's insistence, his quiet respect for the Foundation growing after his reporting. "Congratulations," he said. "You've turned your family's story into something larger than its scandal." I thanked him, and for a moment we stood by the window watching the city below. "Do you ever miss them?" he asked finally. I took a breath. "Not the way they were," I said, "but maybe the way they could have been." He nodded thoughtfully, then left me with a quiet handshake. The night ended in a hush of laughter and soft goodbyes. When the last guest had gone, I walked to the far corner of the studio. The framed check gleamed faintly under the lights. Beneath it, I had added a small plaque that read, "Gifted to Claire Donovan, artist and founder." Proof that light never dies in honest hands. Lydia joined me, her shoes clicking softly across the floor. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's not about me," I replied. "It's about what comes after." She smiled. "Then it's exactly what he wanted." Outside, the night was cool and clear. I stepped onto the balcony overlooking the skyline, the city stretching endlessly into the dark. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small beneath it. I felt grounded, connected to something larger, something that would outlast me. The foundation would continue to grow, and the world would keep spinning, but the quiet truth beneath it all would remain. The real inheritance wasn't money or power, it was clarity earned the hard way. And as the lights of the studio glowed behind me, I understood that every loss had led here to this balance of strength and peace. Somewhere far away in a house surrounded by desert light, my parents were living their own version of silence. I didn't hate them anymore, but I also didn't need them to find my worth. When I went back inside, Grace was standing near the window, her camera raised. "Hold still," she said. "You look like you finally belong in your own story." I smiled. The shutter clicked, and for once, I didn't flinch. Winter came softly that year with long blue mornings and early dusk that made the city lights shimmer against the frost. From the windows of the studio, I could see the skyline reflecting in streaks of gold, familiar, but never the same twice. A full year had passed since my grandfather's will was read, and yet it still felt as though his voice echoed through every wall of this place. His presence had become less a memory and more a rhythm, a steady reminder that purpose mattered more than applause. The foundation had grown into something far beyond what I'd imagined. We'd expanded our residencies, opened a second studio in Portland, and partnered with schools that had never had the resources to teach art before. Lydia oversaw the new programs, tireless and calm as always. Grace became a mentor to incoming residents, her quiet confidence blooming in ways that made me proud every time I watched her teach. Even Ryan found his footing again. He visited occasionally, helping with logistics and speaking to the younger artists about failure, something we both understood differently now. One gray afternoon, as the staff prepared for our winter exhibit, I received another letter from Arizona. This one was short, just a few lines in my father's handwriting. "We're proud of what you've built. We were wrong to measure worth the way we did. Your mother sends her love." I read it twice before setting it on my desk. There were no excuses, no explanations, just a quiet attempt at peace. It was more than I'd expected and exactly enough. When I told Lydia about it later that evening, she smiled gently. "He's learning," she said. "Sometimes people need to lose everything before they start seeing clearly." I nodded, unsure if forgiveness was the right word for what I felt, but I knew something inside me had finally settled. The anger had faded into something lighter, understanding maybe, or simply release. The night of the exhibit arrived on the first snowfall of the season. The studio glowed from within, the sound of soft music carrying across the open floors. Guests wandered through the rooms, stopping to admire the residents' work. Each piece told a story of transformation, raw and real, imperfect yet full of grace. I moved quietly among them, content to let their art speak louder than any speech could. In the final room, under a single spotlight, hung a new addition beside the framed $10 check. It was a photograph I had taken earlier that year, the first group of residents standing in the morning light of the studio, their faces bright with possibility. Beneath it, the plaque read, "For those who create when no one is watching." People stopped there, often studying it in silence, some smiling, others blinking back emotion. As the evening drew to a close, Grace approached with her camera in hand. "You should stand by the window," she said softly. "The snow's catching the city lights. It's how this began, remember?" I smiled, stepping into the pale glow as she lifted the camera. The shutter clicked, once the sound small but full. When the guests were gone and the last light was dimmed, I stayed behind. The studio was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the faint wind outside. I walked to my office, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window where the snow fell thick and slow. On the desk beside me lay my grandfather's old film camera, the one he'd given me that final day. I traced the worn leather strap and thought of everything that had changed since that moment. He had once told me not to let inheritance take my eye, that truth would cost more than I expected. He was right, but it had given back more than it ever took. It gave me clarity, purpose, and a family I had chosen people who saw worth in honesty, not appearances. Outside, the city glowed under a blanket of white. Somewhere far away, my parents were watching a different kind of light fade behind the desert horizon. I hoped quietly that they'd found a bit of peace, too. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle. For the first time in years, there was no need to prove anything to them, to the world, or even to myself. I had become the person my grandfather believed I could be. The legacy wasn't about the foundation or the studio or the headlines. It was about learning that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the steady choice to build something better, even when no one applauds. As the snow fell thicker, I whispered a quiet thank you to him, to the life that had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Then I picked up my camera, stepped to the window, and took one last photograph of the city, soft glowing alive. Before I go, I want to leave you with this. The world will try to tell you what you're worth. Don't let it. Define it for yourself through what you build, through the good you leave behind. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, your light, no matter how small, might just change everything.